All right, so let's now consider a higher level of abstraction that will allow us to do the mapping automatically. For this, we're going to be using a library called jaxb, right? That is a library that binds, the B is for binding, for Java object and XML binding, right? It's an API for XML binding, Java API for XML binding, that allows you to create a schema for Java, right? And then map XML documents, right, to that schema, so that it can be easily converted back and forth between the two, right? So let's create a Java class, student.java. So let's do that. So let's create a separate one here. Will be new class, and this will be under CS5200 XML, and this will be jaxb. And this will be student.java. Okay. So in here, we're going to capture a couple of things, right? We're going to capture the schema for the various fields that we'd like to capture. Oops, not there. There you go. And we're gonna generate the various setters and getters for the students. We'll also generate maybe the constructors for this with the all argument constructor and the no argument constructor. There we go. So we have a fully working student model, right? What we'd like to be able to do is grab a document that has an XML student. Let's create that. Let's create the student XML document and see if we could map it, right? So let's create here an XML document, other, and XML file, next, and we'll call it student XML. So that's student XML. We're going to copy and paste this content right here, student. So just one single student, just Alice for now, right? We'll look at how to manipulate multiple documents in a minute, right? But let's do this simple case first. Once we have that, we can now start. We can now start. Well, we did this already. We added the constructor. We added the setters. Let's now to map the two worlds, right? To let jaxb know what should we map to what, right? We're going to annotate. We're going to go back to our class and say, hey, this particular field over here, this is an attribute, and this is an element, right? And this is the document root. Right? We're going to annotate it so that jaxb can come back, right? And when it reads the XML document, it reads the Java class, says, okay, I know what I need to put where, right? So let's do that. Let's grab the, let's first load the annotation. So let's go to a student, and let's load here the JavaX XML binding annotation. Allows us to annotate, right? Use aspect-oriented programming to annotate each one of these elements. We're saying that this class, right, represents the root of some embedded XML. Okay, and the following can be either represented as attributes, or they can represent it themselves as elements again, right? So let's annotate the ID. We're going to annotate it as an attribute. So this is an attribute. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. We annotate the setters and getters. In Java, there is the notion of what is called a Java bean. Okay, Java beans is a somewhat of a standard in Java, right? That when you write or create classes, you should follow a particular naming convention, right? Certain conventions. So one of the conventions is that right. So classes are capitalized, right? They're camel case but capitalized. Fields are also camel case but start with a lowercase. The setters and getters are also based off of the names of the attributes, right? and they start with set and get, right? And then after that, they're camel cased with the name of the attribute. So this ID has a set ID and a get ID somewhere. Where's the get ID? Oh, there it is. I'm blind. And so on and so forth. Yes? So it has a naming convention. And as long as you follow that naming convention, a lot of good things happen, right? The infrastructure, right, like such as IDEs, right, or J2EE containers and servers and all sorts of other libraries, right, assuming that you follow this convention, a lot of automatic things happen, right? One of them, right, is that it allows you to expose the names of these attributes through the use of these setters and getters. So the outside world knows about these attributes not necessarily by these private fields, which are not accessible from outside. Nobody can see these. Right? The only way for outside to know what the actual names of the attributes are is through public accessors. Okay. So in this case, we are going to annotate the set ID, and this is how the jaxb library will know that you have an attribute called ID, or you have an element called username, and you have an attribute called last name, and you have an attribute called first name. Okay, right? So this is how it knows the names of the attributes, not necessarily the names of the fields inside, although it's good practice, right, that they are based one off of the other. Okay, but I could certainly just call this F, right? It would still have an attribute called first name, because the setter and getter are set first name and get first name. Whatever I call it internally, it might not necessarily matter, right? But nevertheless, it's a good practice to keep them the same. Everybody okay? All right, so there we go. So we've annotated this, that is going to be an XML root. We've annotated the IDs to be an attribute of this root element, right? And these are all going to be child elements of this parent element. Everybody okay? Right? So I've basically described this same exact document. Right? I've described this same exact document. All right? Okay, now that we have that, we can start actually writing code to do the magic, right? That given this XML document, here's a Java object that refers to that represents that XML document, or vice versa. Given this Java instance, what is the XML document, right? So let's do that. Next, let's create a class that does this. So let's create a class here. We'll call it jaxb example with the main. Okay. So in this main, what we'll do is we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to need to load a couple of things. First, what, this is writing or reading? This is writing. Is this marshalling or unmarshalling? Oh, okay, so I already had this XML document. I'm not supposed to have it yet. Let me throw it away. Let me delete it. We're going to create the student document, the XML document first. We'll read it back in a little later. Let's create it. So, all right, so first let's instantiate Alice. There it is, Alice with ID 123. Username Alice, and first name Alice, and last name Wonderland. There we go. So there's Alice, and what we want to do is write it to an XML document, right? And vice versa, read it and write it from XML document. So to do that, we're going to first use we're gonna use a library, a class called jaxb context, which we're going to tell it, hey, this is the Java version of this, right? So there's a class, there's a student class, and I want you to create an object for me that I can deal with this Java object, right? Whether I want to write it or read it, okay? So for that, we're going to create a jaxb context where we provide the student class as an argument so that it can read it and determine, oh, okay, you've annotated as this being the XML root. These are going to be the fields, right? And these are going to be the IDs and the attributes and the elements and whatnot. Yes? So it's going to parse it. We need to import it. Let's import it. Also, new instance throws an exception, so let's surround it. There we go. So let's surround it with a try catch. And let's fix the indentation. Then we're going to create an instance of a marshaller. So marshallers are a mechanism that is very, very common when you are going between two different ways of representing data, right? So, for instance, when you go from a server or from a browser, when you post data, when you submit a form, right? It needs to be data needs to be converted from some object representation inside of the browser, right? It needs to be streamed as zeros and ones across the wire, and then reconstituted on the other side on the server. Yes? That mechanism of converting from a Java or JavaScript object into a string representation and then back again into some other representation, that's called marshalling, right? Or converting from one representation down to another representation is called marshalling. The other way around is true. When you go back and you want to come back to the original representation, that's called on-marshalling, right? So bring it back from its string representation or binary representation back into its constituent implementation. So marshaller is going to allow us to marshal our Java object into XML. Okay, and marshaller we're going to need to import it from JavaX XML bind, right? And that's it. Okay, now we have it. We'll also need the XML document or file where we want to write it to. Okay, so there is my, and we would like to write it in the same directory where we are, and that's as source, XML, and jaxb. I think that's where we are, jaxb, and I want to write it into alice.xml. Yes? Okay. All right, and file, we need to import that. Import it. And that's it, okay. And then we're going to marshal. We're going to marshal this. We're going to say, take the Alice instance that you have here as a Java object, and I want you to write it into its XML file. All right, so let's run this and see it blows up. Uh-oh, what?
After SRC, you have CS.
Ooh, CS5200, thank you, CS5200. Excellent, thank you. Let's run this as a Java application. And did it work? Let me refresh. There it is. There's Alice. So Alice was written and we can't read it. What? There we go. Okay, the indentation was off. There we have it. Student ID 123, first name, last name, and username, right? And we could do it the other way around. Instead of using a marshaller, we can do it an on-marshal, right? But for that, let's go and use a little bit more sophisticated example, right? So for instance, having a list of users, right, that might have multiple users inside of them. All right, so let's do that next.